Let's give our attention up front to Sarah Jane for her capstone presentation. Take it away, Sarah Jane.
So the comedian Rob Delaney tells this story about grief and grief work that just pierces my heart like no other. Rob's son Henry was just 2 years old when he died of a brain tumor from brain cancer. And immediately following the death, Rob went into the bathroom in the family home and stared into the mirror and then punched himself in the face, giving himself a bloody nose. Dazed and confused, he stumbles out of the bathroom into the hallway and finds his mother and a hospice worker there and says, "I just punched myself in the face." And the hospice worker takes a deep breath and looks at Rob and looks at Rob's mother and says, "That is completely normal." We cannot fix grief. It is one of the most brutal experiences of being human. What we can do is to show up and be with grief and be with people in grief. There are some cultural understandings that in order to process grief, you need to be in community. You need to be witnessed in your grief, as well as you need to witness others in theirs. People with intellectual disabilities are not being given the opportunity to be in community, to be witnessed, to be acknowledged in their grief. Adults with intellectual disabilities are at least 3 times as likely as the general public to experience complicated grief. I first became aware of this marginalization when I studied to become a death doula. I then learned more through this great book in the grief and loss class here about social justice in grief and loss. And I got really curious about this, so I started to engage in conversations online about how we show up for these very important people. Then about 6 months ago, I had the opportunity at my internship site to begin working with an adult with prolonged grief disorder from the death of his brother almost 20 years ago. We desperately need providers who are tuned and aware of the special needs of folks with intellectual disabilities when it comes to grief work. So, it is my hope that through this presentation, through the materials that are available on the website by taking a picture of the QR code, that you will join me in advocating for and providing better care for adults with intellectual disabilities. I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question, and honestly, I'm kind of embarrassed that I had this question when I started this work, but I think it's important to discuss, and that question is, can an adult with an intellectual disability conceive of death and conceive of grief and loss? Well, in my research for this, I found out I am not the only one to have this question. Most research actually begins with this. And it immediately points to Piaget's 4 stages of cognitive development. The idea that the ability to understand the concrete nature of mortality and death is a function of the concrete operational stage. Now, many folks with intellectual disabilities will never reach this stage. So here we can push back by using attachment theory and Bowlby's research, which states that there is an observable grief response in children as young as 2 years old. However, never having had the opportunity to engage in these difficult questions in our death and disability phobic society, many well-meaning family members and caregivers still believe that they are doing the right thing, shielding adults with ID from news of a death, from participation in the grief surround, never explaining to them what is happening. However, these people, we know through through research that they are still experiencing grief. Speaking of how we experience grief, we have a myopic reliance on verbal communication to process grief. When grief presents in non-speaking and non-verbal ways, it is often vastly misunderstood as an individual who is acting out, has poor behavior. The research shows that the reaction of care providers to this kind of behavior is to engage in behavioral modification or administer psychotropic medication to quell the grief response in the griever. So, in addition to this, individuals with ID are acutely susceptible to complicated grief responses due to secondary losses. So I have kind of a funny question here, but who in this room has an opinion about toothpaste? Okay, is there like a flavor you like or a kind? Less chemicals. So you want like a natural toothpaste? Yeah. Anybody else?
I mean, I will not do without my Arm & Hammer.
Oh, that's disgusting. So gross. So it might seem kind of silly to think about this and be talking about toothpaste at this point, but I want you to consider yourself in the position of an adult with an intellectual disability whose mother just died. She's been your caregiver, your sole caregiver, for the past 20 years. You lived with her in the family home. Since her death, you have been moved into a group home. Now, you used to go to Target once a month to pick out toothpaste and sundries, but now the group home, in an effort to streamline their systems, purchases a bulk pack of Colgate. You don't get Arm & Hammer anymore. Every time you brush your teeth, you're suffering a loss of routine. So now stop and think. How many moments in your day of autonomy, of what's familiar, you encounter? When an adult loses a caregiver, everything can be wiped away. These touchstones that are our entire worldview and sense of comfort is wiped out along with that invaluable attachment relationship. All of this is compounded by a system that has insufficient resources, training, and support. Of all the studies and literary reviews that I compiled in my research, the largest study size was 150 individuals. That's barely a pilot study. I tried to find a grief group for my client to attend. I called every hospice in the Boulder and Denver area that I could think of. I called community care boards, which are the boards which administer supports to adults with IDs, and I called individual providers. It doesn't exist. Meanwhile, we know, and the research exists, that targeted grief therapy improves bereavement outcomes for adults with intellectual disabilities. It supports faster returns to levels of functioning and happiness of that prior to the loss. So, all that said, here, I'm trying the wrong one here. All that said, here are my objectives for this presentation. First, that you would understand the problem. I hope we've got this under control. Second, I'm going to walk through case conceptualization and assessment that will meet the needs to be reimbursed by Medicaid. Because if you work with a client from this population, their insurance is going to be Medicaid. And finally, I'm going to look at adapting treatment planning and interventions to support folks with ID. Oh, and I'm going to lose my place. All right, so before we go into logistic and bureaucratic requirements, I want to encourage you that as a pre-case conceptualization, you can consider a few things. The first is that of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and a reminder that they are compounding. So you can't go up a level if you're not meeting the base needs. Now, when you assess someone on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're not assessing if their needs are being met. You are assessing if the individual has a perception of if their needs are being met. So take into consideration the person who has moved. Sure, they may have access to shelter and food, but are they secure in the fact that they will have access to shelter and food? And it's important that we work on each of these levels first before we go into things like belonging or self-actualization, because if you go there too soon, folks just don't have the capacity to do that kind of work. The second thing I want to talk about are these really amazing books, and there's a couple extra of them on the table. And these are called Books Beyond Words, and they're from this amazing group in the UK, Socialized Medicine, that are books that are for folks that talk about really difficult topics with folks with disabilities. And the way that you use this is you sit down with your client, and if the client is verbal, you sit next to them and you begin to go through the story. There's no words, Books Beyond Words, but the story depicts a death of a mother, death at a hospital. They also have books about illness and things like that. And what you can do is sit next to your client and say, what do you think this story's about? What do you see in this picture? What is happening in you as you look at this? In this way, you're actually able to get an insight into the individual's experience of what is happening instead of basing yourself off of some other framework or understanding. Even with folks who are nonverbal, you can sit next to them and maybe you offer some suggestions, watching them for affective and somatic cues of their response. Maybe they become tense at a moment or show dissociation in another. Something might be particularly emotional or heart-touching. So, with that in mind, according to the Uniform Service Coding Standards for the state of Colorado, these are the diagnoses related to grief that will be accepted by Medicaid. So first, you have an adjustment disorder, which we all know and thank God for. And then second, we have a prolonged grief disorder, the only grief diagnosis in the DSM. To have a prolonged grief disorder, the death must have occurred at least a year ago. You're going to have to prove acute symptomology, and it has to show significant interruptions in activities of daily life. Then you have generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder if symptomology aligns. It's important here to know that folks with intellectual disabilities actually have significantly higher rates of anxiety and depression than the general public as a starting ground. And then last, if the loss is related to a trauma, you can also consider PTSD. Now, there are 3 specialized assessment tools to support you in this process. The first is the BNAD, or the Bereaved Needs Assessment Tool. This tool was designed by nurses and psychologists, and it's an assessment tool that focuses on the behavior of the individual to make an assessment. So a caregiver is reporting what kind of changes in behavior they're observing in their client. The next is the CGQ-ID. This is a complicated grief questionnaire that has been adapted for adults with intellectual disabilities. It is a Likert scale, and it can be completed by the individual, by the caregiver, or a combination of the two. And then last, we have the adapted PHQ-9 and GAD-7. And these are the coolest things ever, y'all. They are the PHQ-9 and GAD-7, but they are in images. So it's all done in an image format. And I want to draw your attention, I've got a couple of these on here, to the back, because there are instructions on how to conduct the assessment that are simplified and put into terms that are easier to understand. I've actually started using these questions with typical clients. So I found them to be that helpful. All right, so these are 9 principles for working with adults with ID. These were originally introduced in 1986. I know they are older than I am. They are still applicable. I'm not going to review the first 6 for time's sake, and I think they're the most easy to understand, but I want to address these bottom 3. The first of which is the idea of involving caregivers in the care. So from a logistical standpoint, within Medicaid, we have this beautiful 90846 code. And a 90846 code allows you to meet with caregivers, guardians. You just have to make a case that the person has an influence on the client, and the discussion has to stay on the client's treatment. But this gives you time to meet with caregivers to review history, clarify questions that might be coming up, check in on how someone's progress is going, and also offer coaching and feedback so there can be consistent language and reinforcement from the caregiving team of the work that you are doing in session. Second is transference and countertransference. We live in a society that is incredibly disability phobic. I swim in the soup, I have bias. So I've used supervision, peer support, and peer supervision consult groups as a way to take those pieces of bias and pluck them out of my head prior to entering into the therapy room. Doesn't mean it still doesn't happen, but I'm able to review that with a supervisor and make reparative action when necessary. And then the last is this very interesting term called disability rehabilitation approaches. And this is just a really fancy way of saying, do you talk about the disability? This scared the living stuff out of me, but fueled by having had Medicaid required social location conversations with all of my clients over the previous year, I tiptoed into it. Now, it took a while. We had a social location conversation, but we didn't go direct there. And then there was a moment about 3 months into treatment where it was in the room. And so I looked at my client and I said, what's it like to have Down syndrome? And he paused and he looks at me and he goes, I'm still really confused as to what Down syndrome is. So I start sweating profusely. I don't think I actually resolved this and answered it well, but this thing has happened since then, which is that we talk about difference in session, and we talk about what it's like to be confused. And I just learned this week that not only is he talking about it with me, he's talking about it with his parents now for the first time as well. I keep going for the wrong one. All right, so there is no better approach that I think could come into play for this work than that of the transpersonal approach. And for me, it really boils down to the fact that transpersonal therapy is phenomenological therapy. The APA has this definition of phenomenological therapy that I love. It says the emphasis is on the client's process of self-discovery rather than on the therapist's interpretation of the individual's underlying psychodynamics. We can have an evidence-based approach, and we can allow spontaneous, loving, dynamic interaction and foster a relationship with a client that really is the work of therapy. So the framework of grief process that is most predominant in this work is Wharton's 4 tasks of mourning. And these can be kind of interchangeable, pretty self-explanatory. The idea being that a healthy process of grief will include this work. And I vary a little bit away from Wharton in this because I don't think we complete grief work. I think that grief actually continues forever, and we just get better at doing the work. It's a lot like what the poet Mary Oliver says. It's not the weight upon your back, but how you carry it. All right, so let's talk transpersonal interventions. Mindfulness work means knowing yourself, knowing your seat, holding the room, monitoring your own regulation first. I've also had a lot of success teaching mindfulness tools and fundamentals to my client. He does an amazing extended exhale. And as well as DBT, ACT, and MBCBT are all evidence-based methodology for the treatment of folks with intellectual disabilities. Next, we have Gestalt. And if you have done any sort of exploration into grief work, being Naropa, you've learned about empty chair and the really powerful process that can be in grief. One of the things that I kept coming across in the research is the idea of adapting interventions to be relevant to the individual. And so I knew I wanted to do this, and I was like, I am going to set up the most beautifully adapted intervention you have ever seen. So my client is an actor, and I was like, we're going to put on a play, and you're going to have a role, and then you'll also have this role for your brother. And I brought in props, and we sit down, and I'm even having him switch chairs, and it is not going well. It is like too much, and it's messy, and I'm in the middle of it, and he's a little confused, and I'm like, okay, maybe I shouldn't admit this in here, but I do the thing where you're like, okay, universe, throw me a bone here. I am trying to do the right thing. And I look over in the room and I see this bear. And I say, hey, what if we have the bear stand in for your brother? We just make it a little easier, slow it down a little bit. We take the prop that he had been using, this kerchief, and put it on the bear. Something you need to know about my client's brother who passed is that he had severe disabilities as well. He was nonverbal, he was never mobile, and he was actually quite small his entire life. And from both my client and his parents, I know that they were inseparable, and part of them being inseparable was my client would pick up his brother from the time that he was first able and carry him from room to room throughout the house to be with him. So we've got the bear in the chair, and my client runs a line or two, and then he turns and looks at me and he goes, oh, he's here. And I lean back in my chair. My client gets up from his seat and goes over to the chair and picks up the bear and begins, I love you. I miss you so much. You are such a good big brother. I can't wait to be with you again someday. It was one of the most powerful moments that I have ever experienced. And just following it, my client had an enormous cathartic release. When I did a visit a few weeks later with his parents, an appointment, they shared with me, I said, how is treatment going? And they said, we just don't know how to tell you this. And you say that it's his work and he was ready, but since he came to see you, it is like an enormous weight has been lifted off of him. He was able to move through the catharsis that had been holding that energy inside for 20 years. I also want to point at the unique applicability of Gestalt for disability rehabilitation approaches. Deb Bowman, yes, our Deb Bowman from MTC, wrote a paper with a student, Nancy, about their work with Nancy's disability of deafness. And of course, if you don't know, Deb is physically impaired. She's missing an eye. And in this paper, it outlines the way that they were able to have this process and to directly address the disability in a way that Nancy had never experienced before. So if you're interested in reading this paper, my first suggestion is that you go to the Naropa Library and suggests maybe they have it here. And then second, you can email me and I'll be happy to share it with you because it is truly phenomenal. Ritual is an important part of everyone's grief process. And as providers, our first responsibility is to advocate that folks with ID are involved in the grief surround, leading up to the death, the time of death, attending the funeral, and having an opportunity to create a ritual that speaks to them to say goodbye. Meaning making presents another one of those uncomfortable questions. Can an individual with an intellectual disability meaning make? Well, I really love this definition of meaning making that comes from Gilbertson and McPherson that says meaning making can be the distinction between making sense of a loss and finding benefit from a loss. Even if the only thing that comes from it is that they've entered into this sacred relationship with you, it's still movement through. This is my last slide, I promise. Oh, I also want to say that there is research that shows that post-traumatic growth is possible for adults with intellectual disabilities. Don't limit what people can do. So as I close, I want to speak to the utility of community groups. They are actually, grief groups alone are not proven to be effective in treating grief. But where they are particularly effective is when there is disenfranchised or marginalized grief. As I stated before, there are not groups in the area, and I will not let this stand. And so I will be starting some groups this summer. We're going to start with a discussion group. My dear friend Lisa here is supporting me in that path with contacts, and I cannot wait to begin offering this to our community. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for letting me go 2 minutes over, and I hope that I've inspired you to take an interest and advocate for this population and to be of service by taking steps to treat these valuable members of our community.